Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem studio. Jonathan will be here in the next show. This is the week in which Israel turns the page in its Hebrew calendar on 1 year and opens a new one. It's a good time to take stock and survey Israel's strategic outlook, regionally as well as globally. To discuss this issue, I am joined here in the studio by Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserve, Reuven Ben Shalom, cross-cultural strategist and columnist at the Jerusalem Post, Ms. Paula Slier, TV7 Analyst, and Dr. Eran Lerman, Vice President at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies and lecturer at Shalem College. Colonel Ben Shalom, Israel sees itself as a regional superpower, but it is always acting under the constraints of other even bigger powers, such as the United States and most recently Russia. What is Israel's real position in the regional scheme of things?
Well, first, I think absolutely not a superpower, not even a regional power, but a small country that happens to be extremely powerful and backed by a superpower, which is the United States. When we like to talk about our own capabilities and abilities, but even in the IDF's doctrine of our strategic thinking, of course, the backbone of our military is the United States, and strategically, of course, backed by the United States. So I think that we should see ourselves in that dimension, and thankfully we have this strategic alliance with the United States. We have the ear of Russia, which happens to be very dominant in the region. Right now, we have no existential threats, so we're not talking about that kind of field. So I think that is the dimension to see us. We should certainly be feared and valued. Remember that also, don't make the classic Israeli mistake of talking about the Middle East of enemies. We have many partners and allies in the region. Look at the map. Most of the map around us are allies, partners, great opportunities, great dialogues and interactions there.
But when we talk about a strategic outlook, here in Israel, we usually throw around quite freely the word strategic, even when all we mean is that one hill is higher than the next target. What is Israel's basic strategy, or rather grand strategy? What does Israel want to achieve for which it is using its military and other executive agencies?
It's very simple. We don't know. It doesn't exist. It's not written anywhere. There's no website you can go to and read it. The best document I know about strategy is the IDF. So remember, it's just a small, not small, but a component, okay, of our grand strategy. And they have written a very good document, recently updated it, so you know what they think, you know how they perceive the battlefield and their challenges. But strategically, grand strategy, we don't know. We're talking about the new Hebrew year now, and we're also going to make the typical mistake of talking about our goals for this year and what we can achieve. Is Donald Trump going to surprise us with his deal that he's been cooking? I don't think so. I would even recommend let's not talk about a year, but talk about a decade, talk about 50 years. And this, we absolutely have no idea. So I will say that our strategy is to continue the fulfillment of our dream after coming back to this country, reestablishing our homeland, and not only existing here, but thriving here, becoming a light upon the nation, all the nations. And I think we do agree on some basic national components like that.
Paula, the founding fathers of Israel had a vision quite similar to what Reuven just described, but they wanted to gain the acceptance of Israel's neighbors, that is, the Arab countries. The Palestinians were not considered a main actor, one of the main actors at that time. In the years since you have come to live in Israel, to know the region, what is the strategy from which the military strategy is derived? In your view, what is Israel trying to achieve?
I would agree with what Reuven said, that initially the strategic strategy is establish a country and make it powerful. And I think the country is strong, it is powerful. I think the strategy after that, and there's obviously many strategies, is create where possible, friendships with the Arab countries that surround you. Now, unfortunately, the countries that are directly surrounding Israel are enemy states. But fortunately, there haven't been too many conflicts over the years. But if you look at how that relationship is happening now, there are alliances that Israel is increasingly making more with the Arab world. For example, with the Sunni states. For example, Israel is friendly with many of the Gulf states, with Jordan, with Egypt. And I think in that respect, you have Israel becoming a stronger player vis-a-vis what is happening in the region, in the Arab world. So Saudi Arabia, for example, there we have, it's an open secret, there's some kind of relationship happening, and Israel's able to use that against its arch nemesis, Iran. And in that respect, Israel has played the game very well in creating Iran to be this massive threat, not only to Israel, it's a massive threat to Saudi Arabia, and by extension to the United States.
It seems, Dr. Lerman, that the old saying ascribed to Lord Palmerston about not having permanent alliances but also permanent interests applies to Israel, because Paula mentioned Iran. Iran used to be one of Israel's best allies, and Turkey as well. Now, both of them are hostile in various degrees towards Israel. Who can Israel count on for the duration?
Well, first of all, the United States is more than a strategic ally. This is a special relationship. This is not just the sum of our interests and their interests. It is rooted in aspects of who we are and what does the American people see as their foundational concepts of who they are. I still remember listening to one of those televangelists talking about the children of Israel. It took me a few minutes to realize he was talking about America. He was not talking about us. But it was this aspect of
even in Senator McCain's funeral, the city shining on the hill, Jerusalem, was mentioned once and again as a religious undertone.
And there are other deeper aspects. But very often, when you think about grand strategy, you're thinking about who is the enemy. When the American administration, so in the post-World War II period, formulated a grand strategy, containment, they did this with a very specific enemy in mind. Now, in our case, the enemy used to be Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism was basically the driving force of much of the region. It was committed to our destruction.
Gamal Abdel Nasser,
the Baathists, and others. This is a spent force. And in this respect, life has changed for us. Egypt is very much, as Paula mentioned, on our side of the ledger in the regional balance of power. We do face a multifaceted enemy called Islamist totalitarianism. Not Islam as a religion. I would always urge Israelis to steer away from those in the West who think of Islam as the enemy or Islamic civilization as the enemy. It's a modern political perversion. As such, by the way, like all past totalitarianism, brown or red or black, it can be defeated, but it is an enemy. And the grand strategy is to diminish and ultimately defeat this enemy. This has created, in recent years, this system of alliances in the region. And by the way, I would redefine the region. The Eastern Mediterranean now has become part of our system of regional alliances, including Greece and Cyprus, because Turkey is now dominated by a government, a party, which is Islamist by orientation, Islamist with increasingly totalitarian touches. Iran is an Islamist totalitarian player. The third type of player is the IS elements, which we should never ignore. They are out there and they could do harm. And it is our grand strategy to build the capacities to fight all three if necessary.
Reuven, what is the value of peace in Israeli strategy? Or rather, what is the price of peace which Israel is willing to pay? And one should mention that this did not start with 1967. In the 1950s, there were ideas of Arab countries signing peace agreements with Israel if Israel give up half of the Sea of Galilee or parts of the Negev, the southern part of Israel, which David Ben-Gurion wisely rejected. But for the last 51 years, obviously, the territorial question had to do with what Israel has held onto since the Six-Day War.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about peace, we have to differentiate between the countries surrounding Israel and the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue, I think, is almost unsolvable. It's also perceived differently inside of Israel, depending what political party you belong to. And the way we view reality is so different. Many of us believe that holding on to the territories means not only rejecting a two-state solution, but going to a one-state solution, which means we won't even be a democracy anymore. It's our own destruction. Others, right-wing, I think, parties, I think their strategy is hold on more, and another decade, another two, eventually they'll cancel UNRWA, no more refugees, and it'll be okay. We'll give them some kind of autonomy, it'll be fine. So this is a huge clash inside of the Israeli society. When I grew up, peace, of course, was our main aspiration. We all dreamt peace, we're driving toward peace. We knew that when we fought for peace. I think now the terminology is changing because we don't even believe anymore that we can achieve in our lifetime the end of the conflict, that the Palestinians will miraculously say, you know what, after 100 years of conflict, you won, you're right, we'll go somewhere else, we'll go to Jordan. It's never going to happen, right? So I think what now we see in our strategy now is more looking for stability, for quiet. The Arabs call it hudna, or they have all these names, to have a period of quiet before the next clash. But as far as resolving this, I don't see it. Externally, almost no problem, because we have no dispute with our neighbors. We want nothing from them. Lebanon is ridiculous. Hezbollah is destroying the country of Lebanon for an imaginary clash with Israel when there is no clash with Israel. No dispute, no lands, no nothing. And even the things that are there are completely invented. Syrians may dream about the Golan Heights, but that's ridiculous because they're never, ever going to get that piece of land that they held for such a short time back. So the main issue on our plate is the Palestinians. Still, I think we should push to some kind of mechanism and understanding and agreement with them that we can have some kind of future, because sustaining the position as it is now, I think, is impossible.
Paula, the elected government is supposedly, and rightly so, legitimately, expressing the will of the people. However, there is a problem in the connection between politics and policy in Israel. How do you view it?
Well, if I can just follow on what you said first about the Palestinians. The Palestinians actually see the situation completely different, and they think Israel's not serious about making peace. They're very afraid that there will be some kind of deal on the table, that Trump might be cooking up behind the scenes, that we'll see a one state only in Gaza and not in the West Bank. The whole UNRWA issue, which is very topical at the moment in terms of refugees, the Palestinians are concerned that with the United States stopping to provide funding to the UNRWA agency, ultimately the agency will be forced to close down, and then the issue of Palestinian refugees will no longer be on the table, and that for them is one of the cornerstones of what they're looking for peace talks with the Israelis. So in terms of where the Palestinians feel Israel is pushing, they certainly feel incredibly disheartened and further away from any kind of peace deal. So it doesn't look possible that that's going to be something on the agenda coming forward. In terms of what you asked me about politics and policies and how the two come together, as you mentioned, there is such a division in Israeli society itself. Many people talk about the fact that there's no longer even a substantial left-wing population. A lot of your Israelis have become quite right-wing. It's very often said that the government is the most right-wing government that there has been in history. And so in terms of the politics reflecting the population has become more right-wing, the politics have become more right-wing, and that would feed into what I was saying in terms of the despair on both sides and the disbelief on both sides, particularly on the Palestinian issue, as to whether or not something can be achieved.
Regarding what you said about UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Administration, and the general issue of Palestinian refugees, one should note, and this is probably not very well understood outside of the Middle East, that the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of refugees and their offspring in the countries around Israel, as well as in the West Bank and Gaza, are an important constituency without whose support the Palestinian leadership would not feel able to sign any agreement with Israel. And now, national leaders in the United States, in Europe, even in Israel, are used to working with other leaders, with their counterparts, and they are working under the illusion that if they only reach an agreement, they can sign it, and because they represent democracies, it will be fine. It is not the case with the Palestinian community, because their diaspora needs to sign on to the document, and if the refugees don't feel that their case has been represented, they will torpedo the agreement. But Dr. Lerman, let's move to another issue. The standoff countries, the so-called third circle countries, which are not neighboring Israel. There was this feeling in Israel that when Israel has a border with Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, which are the 4 countries bordering it, it is threatened by a possible invasion from their territories, but it can also threaten them because it can easily maneuver and perhaps reach their capitals and oust their leaders or cause other damage. However, there are 2 important countries, Iraq and Iran. There was also Libya for a time, which felt a bit free from Israeli retaliation because they are far away. Iraq is the only Arab country never to have signed the armistice agreements of 1949, even though it did send expeditionary forces to fight in Israel. How is Israel dealing with this threat as part of its strategic outlook?
Well, what they can bring to bear are missiles, essentially. Let's assume that the capabilities of the Iraqi and the Iranian Air Force to penetrate with platforms, with piloted platforms into the Israeli airspace are roughly nil. So at the end of the day, it comes to missiles. So the immense leap in Israeli capabilities in missile defense, which, by the way, is an ongoing project, is, I think, a transformative aspect here. Things that were considered to be technologically on the verge of the impossible have been tested in battle and found to be...
A bullet hitting a bullet.
A bullet hitting a bullet. I don't think Secretary Weinberger ever imagined when he approached Israel to sign up to start the SDI initiative.
Strategic Defense Initiative.
At the time of the Reagan administration, I think he wanted our help on the Hill on this matter. I don't think he imagined that Israel will be the first country in the world with a deployed system tested in battle. This has already made a difference. And so basically we're looking at a system of sliding doors against the standoff or long-range threats. Good civil defense. That's to say Israelis have shelters and civilian losses are limited by that. Then you have active defense. Then you have the capacity to destroy the counter force capability, to go there and destroy the sources of fire, and to exact a price in retaliatory action that would far outweigh the benefit of such an attack. Of course, if this is driven into the nuclear realm by an Iranian nuclear capability, then the equation changes because we can take no risks whatsoever. It is no longer a 99% proposition.
Israel has another weapon at its disposal for such contingencies, and this is lower expectations. Having been bombarded or shelled or missiled by Scads and other derivatives in 1991, and having withstood other attacks, the population here is quite used to it. It is not shocked by sirens and missiles. Of course, it wouldn't want them to hit Tel Aviv, but it is no longer shocked and awed by missiles.
If I could say something about this, there was a malaise in 91 when we were being hit. But I think at the root of it was the decision, a very wise decision. You talk about policy and politics, a very wise policy decision by Shamir, by the way, against pressures from within his own cabinet. He's the own defense minister, not to do anything about it. That was a very wise strategic decision, but for the Israeli people, this was very unnerving. When for resilience, you need also the sense that your own military is going out there and exacting a price from the attacker. This is why Roosevelt launched the militarily meaningless Doolittle raid after Pearl Harbor. And this is why the moral resilience in 2014, vis-a-vis the attacks from Gaza was very difficult because the Israeli people knew that the other side was being hit.
Well, I believe Colonel Ben Shalom was poised in his helicopter on the tarmac regarding this retaliatory raid, which never materialized. Some people, including Defense Minister Ahrens, still believe that Israel should have stuck to its doctrine, much like the Canadian Royal Mounted Police. They always get the man. Israel always strikes back, even if it is for the benefit of the adversary. What's your view?
That you have very good sources. We were actually physically on the runway. We're waiting to go with commandos. So the abilities are there. The only question is if to unleash them or not. And also talking about long or third tier countries like Iran, our government says over and over, all options are on the table. So the layman can say, do we really have options? It's so far. So yeah, certainly there are options. The fact that it's far means that it's challenging. And like I said before, we are a small country. You know the size of our Air Force. How many jets do we have? Several hundred. What could we do? But of course, our strategic capabilities go far beyond the air platform. Look very carefully. In recent months, you see more and more armaments coming online. All you got to do is go to IAI website and Rafael website and see the things that Israelis are manufacturing and selling all over the world. So we probably have similar things. Our capabilities are really shifting and changing. Also, don't forget that the United States comes and augments our capabilities during wartime. Every 2 years we have an exercise. All you got to do is look at what happens during the exercise. 2,000 American personnel on the ground in Israel, augmenting our capabilities with their own, with top-of-the-line equipment, actually preparing here the best of its kind in the world umbrella against such threats. So
this too is a change because Moshe Dayan and others used to say, we don't want any American boys fighting and dying for us.
I don't think we're going to have, and there's no plan to have American troops fighting for us on the front line, but coming to Israel to defend Israel, absolutely yes. Also, I think it's interesting for our rivals to understand that when you shoot at Israel, there are a couple thousand Americans on the ground there, so think maybe very carefully what you do.
Reuven, Iran mentioned missiles and other standoff weapons as almost the only tool in the toolbox that these countries have, but they also have proxies. And these proxies do operate from territories adjacent to Israel. What's Israel's answer to that?
Well, first, it's interesting because many years ago we would perceive the region as, Israel has its own local problems, this terror organization, that terror organization, and we would try to convince the world of reality. And finally, I think everyone's on board. So everyone understands the Middle East. Iran is the main problem with their reach from Yemen to Lebanon, operating their forward operating bases as Hamas and Hezbollah, and they do a good job. And it's very easy for them to activate them and pull the strings when necessary, even when it's to reduce the heat on them for some reason. We always saw this. We always addressed the issue, addressed them understanding this picture. And also look very interesting in the last few years, their footprint in Syria, trying to establish their bases, their capabilities, even challenging Israel militarily. They sent a drone into Israel. And you see that we have been responding, and only in recent days, I think Israeli leadership is revealing the extent of what we've been doing. It's astounding. I mean, we're Israelis, we're officers. I think we ourselves amazed now as civilians to see the extent, hundreds of attacks, taking out, eliminating Iranian capabilities one by one. Every challenge is being met and immediately going in with incredible intelligence and destroying the entire infrastructure. So I believe, and I don't want to sound too arrogant, I know I am, but I believe the Iranians are assessing the situation very carefully, probably amazed, totally shocked at our intelligence, our abilities, our capabilities to know what's going on and to take out their capabilities one by one. And so I think Iran is even assessing their situation. They're back. I think they're a bit back from what they planned to have. So I'm not worried. The full spectrum from going to what Naftali Bennett, the Israeli minister, would say, the head of the snake, and fighting their kind of war of proxies, I think we're all spectrum ready.
Well, what Reuven just mentioned regarding the Israeli announcement or admission of 200 strikes within the last 18 months is a rare and recent exception to the Israeli rule of not talking about it, not necessarily denying it, but not coming out loud and sticking it into their faces. Does that add or detract from Israeli deterrence? The fact that the other side knows that Israel is striking, but Israel keeps mum.
I think it adds to Israel's deterrent. I think it's quite clear that it's a message to Tehran, which is monitoring the proxies. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that so many of these attacks have happened in recent weeks, in recent months. I think it's connected to the idea that most people believe the war in Syria is winding down, whether it's going to be in the next few weeks or the next few months. And I think there's a sense, at least reading the situation, that Israel will not be able to carry out the kind of airstrikes that it does today once that war is over. It will need to give some kind of more justification as to why it is actually attacking inside there. Of course, what is happening in Iran in terms of what is happening in Syria in terms of Iran creating a foothold is of huge concern to Israel. And that's going to be the concern vis-a-vis Syria moving forward. The understanding there also is that Assad's army, where it stands today, is much weaker than it was before the Syria war. So it's not that the threat to Israel from Syria is going to come from Assad per se. It will come from the Iranians who are there and then potentially from Hezbollah. But Hezbollah won't stay in Syria. Hezbollah will move back into Lebanon. And then it's a question of what you said earlier about Lebanon in complete disarray and whether or not there's even potential for conflict between Israel and Lebanon further down the ground.
Let's close this thought-provoking discourse that we had here in one common question with very short answers. And this has to do with the basic tenet underlying Israel's strategy. Is time working for Israel? Is time on Israel's side or not? Eran Lerman.
I would offer think, well-based assessment that time is on our side. Iran is suffering a reverse. Hezbollah is now preparing for the day in which the Iranians will no longer have the money to sustain them in Lebanon, so they're trying to raid the Lebanese economy. It's a very interesting new development. In Syria, we have persuaded the Russians. By the way, one of the address to this story about the 200 raids is Moscow. Look at what we can do to your client if he's not careful. And and I think looking at the year 779, I think we can look with some confidence.
In the Hebrew calendar.
In the Hebrew calendar.
Ms. Slier?
If I could just make the discussion slightly larger, I would agree with you that Israel is in a positive position in terms of how it stands in the region. But on the international stage, and I don't want to give too much credit to an organization like BDS, the Boycott, Disinvestment and Sanctions Organization, but Israel is arguably more isolated on the international stage than it has been in the past. So we might be stronger in terms of the region, but the question is, how are we being perceived? And although we have the American president backing Israel, although there's a very good relationship with Russia, Israel is losing friends in the international community. And that's part of the reason why you have Netanyahu looking eastwards, putting a lot of his tension both in Africa and in China and in other countries in the East, because he's feeling the pressure that Israel on the international stage is isolated more than it has been.
Colonel Ben Shalom, is the trend positive, negative, red, green? Up, down?
Altogether positive, and our situation has never been better, but I'm against perpetuating this situation. I'm not content with this situation. But I think our rivals and challengers have to understand very well that the more time proceeds, they're losing and we are gaining the upper hand.
Which brings us to the close of our show, and we will see our viewers next time. Time is for us. Thank you, Colonel Ben Shalom, Ms. Slier, and Colonel Lerman. Thank you from Jerusalem, and we will see you next time.
TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.